on my side, it's still, yeah, there should have been a beep. So welcome. This is our 6th proper lecture, and this is the 7th lecture meeting. I don't count the first lecture as a proper lecture because it was more like a big picture discussion. Now, the good news is that, we are on track when it comes to grammar, let's say, topics that we are supposed to address. So we enter the realm of the verb phrase, and today we will move within the realm of the verb phrase, and in 1.5 lectures, so probably not next week, but the week after that, we will finish the verb phrase, and I will then present to you the second midterm. And before we started the recording, if you haven't been in the call, since then, if you just joined, in other words, so we are working, the whole university is working on making sure that there are midterms in some form. We just don't know what form, but we will find the form to do it. And I will let you know no later by the end of November. It's possible that there will be maybe a midterm in December, or maybe in January before the exams. We'll see. But of course, they will not, they will not be in conflict with religious and other celebrations. Of course, those will be always respected. So without much further ado, we are exactly here. We haven't lost a single class. We will finish everything according to the schedule. And Sites is fully functional. Google Sites is fully functional. And the issues that I had with YouTube have been resolved. So if you remember, there was the problem with Google Drive and the recordings. Now, I actually had another problem. There was a copyright infringement claim because of the Avengers, but I managed to explain that this is for educational purposes. My account was blocked briefly, so I couldn't upload anything. So, review. Last week, we introduced the verb phrase, and we said the verb phrase is a phrase that has a verb as its head. It's the mantra that you should always know. And then we, on top of that, said a verb phrase, it expresses 5 verbal categories, which are mood, voice, tense, aspect, and mood, voice, tense, aspect, and modality. These verbal categories are the foundation of everything that we say in language, and they are based on morphemes that you can add to the verb. So there can be indicative, imperative, and subjunctive mood, active and passive voice, present and past tense, because there's only ed and ds suffix, perfective and non-perfective, progressive, non-progressive aspect, and there is also modality that expresses notions of ability, probability, assumption, and on top of that, we mentioned that modality is slightly controversial because in English it's not actually realized for inflectional morphemes. So in all other languages it's treated as a verbal category, so we treat it also in English, but strictly speaking it's not based on exactly the same criterion that it's expressed through inflectional morphemes. And in addition to that, you learned that not all verbs were created equal. Some verbs are lexical, some are auxiliary. Lexical ones are the heads of verb phrases, whereas auxiliary ones have grammatical functions, but even they are not the same. There are primary and modal auxiliaries. Be, have, and do are primary. May, can, might, could, would, should, these are modal. And then even modal auxiliaries are not the last subgroup, because there are so-called marginal modal auxiliaries and semi-auxiliaries. These are expressions such as be about to, be going to, be able to, and they behave in many respects like modal verbs, and they have some features of auxiliaries, but they are not real auxiliaries. Then we talked about the verbal paradigm with the 5 forms. So you are very lucky that this is not Latin or Serbian. I know a couple of Brazilian Portuguese speakers who are taking Serbian classes at our faculty. Now, of course, they also switched online, despite the fact that they are paying a lot. I think it's 20,000 dinars per month for those classes. They say that Serbian is actually very difficult to learn because we have so many suffixes. In English, on the other hand, when it comes to verbs, there are only 5 forms. Some of them are identical, especially if you have a verb such as cut, cuts, cut, cutting, cut, cut. Sometimes they are different, but they all have forms. That all these forms have functions. I discussed that. The most versatile is the base form. You didn't think about it, but the base form actually is the foundation of the to infinitive, present subjunctive, all forms of the present simple tense. It's used in the imperative mood. It's actually quite versatile. And we wrapped up with the classification of verb phrases, extended versus restricted. So extended is like the verb phrase is a predicate. Restricted is the verb phrase itself without the object, subject, etc. Simple or complex, depending on whether you have the head and no auxiliaries, that's simple, or you have at least one auxiliary verb. The trick there, if you remember, is that we should always look at the do support as something that is not visible in the positive declarative sentence. So if you have a verb phrase such as John likes cookies and you make it negative, John doesn't like cookies, this do support doesn't count, and you will say that John doesn't like cookies. That doesn't like is a simple verb phrase, because in the positive declarative form there will be no do. This do is like a miracle that makes it possible to form a negation or ask a question when there is no auxiliary. So the keyword is there. Do appears when there is no auxiliary. Do support is this magical way of fixing the absence of auxiliaries that are generally used to ask questions. And that means that now we can start the proper lecture after the review. And we will now go through those 5 verbal categories. And when we finish the verbal categories, we actually will have finished the whole chapter on the verb phrase. So before I switch to verbal categories, this is a good moment to actually open for some questions, comments, clarifications that you may need. Please let me know. I had a weird situation that my mic was not working during office hours on Tuesday, but I had to use chat. But there were very, very few people. So if one of you was that person who couldn't hear me, that was the mic, for example. I apologize for that. So anything that you would like to ask at this point before we move to the new stuff? This was the 5-second rule. That's what it's called in online meetings. If there's silence for 5 seconds, plus you should add like 2 or 3 seconds for unmuting yourself. So more like 8-second rule. Then there are no questions, and we can talk about verbal categories. And the first one is the, let's say, the most well-researched of all the verbal categories, and that is the category of tense. So tense is a verbal category. You should never confuse it with time. Time and tense are not the same. So in this course, you will not have an oral exam. So you may actually think that there's no need to learn all these theoretical descriptions, but actually in the course in Grammar 2, you have questions that pertain to verb phrases because you analyze simple and complex sentences. So actually all of this can appear as a part of the question in the oral exam for grammar 2. We didn't plan it to be like that. It happened during the accreditation process, and we actually were forced to include that oral exam. We actually wanted to get rid of it. But be that as it may, you should know this. So if you have a question in June when there's no COVID and we meet in the oral exam without masks, hopefully, if you get a question like tense as a verbal category, you have to say that tense is different from time. And then you explain that this is so because tense is grammaticalized time. Time, on the other hand, is a universal, non-linguistic category. It's a dimension of physical reality, if you want to use bombastic terms. Whereas tense is simply one of the linguistic categories, and we usually say that tense is the grammaticalized location in time expressed through verbal inflections, which in English, when you think about suffixes that are real used for tense, there are only two, S and ED. And that is the reason why we say that there are only two tenses in English. The present tense, which we know as the present simple tense, because it's not combined with aspect, it's pure tense, and the past simple tense. So I think we can finish tenses in the next 5 minutes because it would be really offending for students of English language and linguistics to, to assume that you don't know how to use the present simple and the past simple tense. I will. So my slides are actually just a revision of what you already know. And more like, let's say, a neat classification of how you should look at the present simple tense and the past simple tense. So let's look at the present simple tense first. We always kind of go from the present to the past. So this also can appear in your final oral exam in June or September, whenever you decide to take the oral exam. There are many exam periods. So you would say that the present simple tense is one of the two tenses in English because tense is grammaticalized location in time, and there are only two inflections in English. I already talked about this. And then you would say that the present simple tense is used in many different ways that we can classify based on the criterion of its primary and secondary meaning. Since it's called the present simple tense, its primary meaning is the present time reference. So we will classify the uses of the present simple tense based on whether it is used to denote the present time. So officially we call it the present time reference, or it has non-present time reference. This is called secondary meaning. And as you probably know, but maybe didn't classify it as such, the present simple tense, although it's called present, can refer to the past and to the future. All of this is possible. So when we talk about the primary meaning, which is the present time reference meaning, there are three, let's say, main groups of meanings that appear there. So the first one is the state present, which is one of, let's say, the best known uses of the present simple tense. But if you think about it, that's not pure present time reference, because the state present, this one which I labeled here as timeless present, let me just use my laser pointer. So timeless present actually doesn't include only now. It includes large parts of the past, and we assume that it will also include large parts of the future. So Earth revolves around the sun, unless somebody, does something terrible to Earth, even when there is no human civilization anymore, and the sun becomes a dwarf, in something like 2 billion years, Earth will still revolve around the sun. So this is more like, let's say, universal truth. It's not present time in its pure sense. Here we also have permanent states, like John is tall. As long as John is alive, and we hope that John will live a long and healthy life, John will continue to be tall. You cannot shrink John. So these are permanent states. Another meaning expressed through the present simple tense that we label as present time reference is habitual present. But again, this is not pure present time reference, because it, like state present, includes past and probably includes some future. So John visits his grandparents every week means he visited them on every week over the last, let's say, the last 2 years, and he will continue to visit them every week into, let's say, the next year or the 2 years after now. The real present time reference is what we call instantaneous present. So this is, for example, I stopped watching football when Beckham was still playing. So this happens in sports commentaries, like Beckham passes the ball to whoever, Zlatan Ibrahimovic. Another instance of this is the performative present simple tense, where, for example, you say, I named this ship the Titanic. This is performatives. Ceremonies, this is another example of performatives. So performatives used in ceremonies. I now pronounce you husband and wife. And that very moment, the two people become husband and wife. Exclamations like here he comes, here's our taxi, or there she goes. These are all instantaneous present exclamations. And if you sometimes watch, because you are bored, TV shop infomercials when they show, you know, new models of juicers, etc., you will hear the so-called instantaneous present for demonstrations when you see the presenter who says, now I put an apple into the power juicer. The power juicer starts processing the apple, and here comes a wonderful apple juice, etc. These are really present time references. So as you can see, when we say present time reference, we actually are being slightly, let's say, imprecise. All these meanings include the present time reference, but only the third one is only the present time reference. State and habitual present denote also sections of the past and the future. The other possibility is for you to use the present simple tense to denote the past or the future. These are secondary meanings. And when it comes to the past time reference, let's deal with it first. This is something that you actually use very often in everyday communication. This is known as historic past. This is usually used when you're gossiping, telling jokes, retelling events, etc. So you say, last Sunday, I'm in my office and somebody knocks on my door. I think to myself, who could this be? This is not the time slot for my office hours. And you continue talking in the present simple tense, but at the very beginning you said last Sunday, and suddenly you are shifting everything into the past because of that. This is called historic past, and this is actually what makes your stories more powerful. If you use historic past to talk about events, that sounds much more dynamic than using the past simple tense. Also with some verbs of communication, like I hear that you're getting married, there's a rumor that they separated. So there's a rumor that they separated means I heard a rumor a couple of minutes ago at least that they separated. And in literature and generally art, including, you know, visual arts, music as a form of art, you often use the past time reference, but expressed through the present simple tense when you say, in War and Peace, Tolstoy portrays. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare talks about forbidden love, etc. So historic past, verbs of communication, discussing works of art. For future time reference, you actually use present simple tense for future time reference in either main clauses or subordinate clauses. When it's used in main clauses, that's very restricted. It only happens with timetables and schedules. So the train leaves at 5, we have grammar lectures at 10:30 next week on Thursday. The flight takes off at 5 p.m., etc. What is more common is for the present simple tense to be used in subordinate clauses, temporal, conditional, relative clauses to denote future time. So this is actually, what you probably learned as a rule, and there is no good explanation for that. There are some historical explanations, but you have to say, I will visit you when I come to New York. When I come to New York, if you think about it, is the present simple tense. So it should have like this present time reference, but it actually denotes future. And it's ungrammatical to say, I will visit you when I will come to New York. So it sounds terrible. He will come if you call him. It's not okay to say he will come if you will call him, unless you stress will, like you are willing to call him. So in conditionals, temporal clauses, and relative clauses, the man she marries, the man whom she will marry, will have to be rich. And that's actually it for the present simple tense. It took a little bit longer than I planned. For some reason, I like to talk a lot about the present simple tense. I will try to cut it short for the past simple tense, because I know that you actually know it, just like the present simple tense. So when it comes to the past simple tense, you now know the drill. So it's always the same with tenses and tense and aspect combinations. Whenever you present them, if you have this question in the oral exam, you will say the past simple tense is one of the two pure tenses in English, because we say tense is a grammatical category expressed through inflectional morphemes. And based on its meaning, we can classify the past simple tense into its primary meaning of the past time reference, and the secondary meaning or the secondary uses when it refers to non-past time reference, and that again is present and future. So just like the present simple tense, the past simple tense is universal. You didn't maybe think about it, but actually their names are misleading. They are really universal. They are like Swiss Army knives of tenses, in the sense that they can, of course, not in all contexts, but they can refer to all parts of the timeline, the past, the present, and the future. So let's look at the past time reference, the primary meaning, and then we'll look at the secondary meaning. So this is slightly red. Now that I think of it, it's not compatible, so compatible with my red laser pointer. But there are three main meanings of the past simple tense that we treat as pure past time reference, its primary meaning. And here there is the event past. For example, he was born in 1977. She closed the door and she got out of her car. So this is actually, unlike the present simple tense, the most common way to use the past simple tense is really about its primary meaning. So the present simple tense is usually used for habitual things. It's not often used for that historic, not for that demonstration present simple use, like instantaneous present. But the past simple tense is, actually its primary use is to denote past time reference, and in particular event. So something that you can describe with a dot on the timeline. So you have, you know, the 20th century, and then you put a dot somewhere in 1977 and say this is this event. This person was born in 1977. Unlike event pasts, state pasts are not dots. They're like stretches. They're like sections of the timeline. He lived in Vienna for 10 years. She admired Jean-Michel Jarre's songs. So this means that it was not one dot, it was like a part of the timeline that you're referring it. For example, you can say she admired Jean-Michel Jarre's songs when she was young. So let's say from the age of 13 to the age of 28. Let's say that this is when you are young. And there is also habitual past. In those days, I always arrived at school late. For these pastime reference uses, you use adverbials of past time: yesterday, last year, a minute ago, etc. And what is really important is that you can notice that some of these meanings are actually the same as the present simple tense. So just like the present simple tense, here you have habitual meaning and the state meaning. And even events are compatible, because if you think about the present simple tense, there are those performatives. I named this ship, so this is similar to this event. So they're actually similar. They're like brothers from another mother. They just refer to different points on the timeline. When it comes to non-past time reference, that's the secondary meaning, of course. There are two possibilities: the present time reference and the future time reference. When it comes to the present time reference, it's actually quite complex. Unlike the present simple tense, which we managed to squeeze into a single, let's say, box that appeared here through the animation. Here we need one box just for the present time reference as a secondary meaning. So there are three types of present time reference that is expressed with the past simple tense, and they all have to do with, let's say, sorry, something that is not all, but most of them have to do with something that is partially hypothetical. So the first one is attitudinal past. I wondered if you are free now. So it's not a fact. You know that the person could be busy, but you are using this as a marker of politeness, and you say, I wondered if you are free now. So you're not wondering, you didn't wonder in the past, you are wondering right now, but in order to show your attitude of politeness, you use the past simple tense. Of course, the present time reference is also available in indirect speech. You say, for example, I can say, my name is Alexander. And then when you put it into the indirect speech, you would say, he said his name was Alexander. That was actually refers to the direct speech is. So in every position where you have, in every sentence where you have indirect speech, and the past simple tense is used in the indirect part of the sentence, that's actually the present time reference. So that's what you know probably as backshift. That's the backshift of present simple. And as I mentioned, the most common, another common way of using the past simple tense to denote present is through hypothetical past. This is used in conditional clauses. For example, if I knew him, I wouldn't treat him like that. So knew him here means if I know him. So this knew doesn't have a past time reference. If I knew him, da ga poznajem. Not da sam ga poznavao. It's not da sam ga poznavao. You would translate this da ga poznajem. Also hypothetical comparison. So generally hypothetical expressions are realized with the past simple tense, and then they have the present time reference. He treats her as if he knew her. In Serbian you would translate it as ponaša se prema njoj kao da je poznaje, a ne kao da ju je poznavao. Wishes, I wish we had more time. This doesn't mean that I wish we had more time in the past. Again, in Serbian translation, it becomes obvious. Volio bi da imamo više vremena. And hypothetical expressions in general. As I told you, suppose, imagine you lived in Norway. Zamisli da živiš u Norveškoj. It's high time we left. Krajnje je vreme da krenemo. I'd rather you didn't smoke in here. Voleo bih da ne pušiš u ovoj prostoriji. So in translation, you can see that this, at least in Serbian, there are differences among languages, but in Serbian, this really is translated with the present simple, let's say, corresponding construction in Serbian. So that's the present time reference. When it comes to the future time reference expressed through the past simple tense, there are some possibilities, but again, there are, let's say, fewer than the present time reference. There are only two. One is attitudinal past. I wondered if you are free tomorrow. So you remember in the first example for present time, it was I wonder if you are free now. That's like asking about right now. I wonder if you are free tomorrow. You're using the past tense to be polite, but you're asking about future. So that by definition is future time reference. So this happens, we call it attitudinal past, but you can call it also politeness past. And hypothetical modal past, in some hypothetical conditional clauses, this modal past that generally denotes the present can denote future. So what would you do if you won the lottery? Šta bi uradio da pobediš, da osvojiš tiket na lutri? Even in Serbian, we would translate it with the present, but we know that the present can refer to the future. So this is actually why. This actually stems from the fact that past simple tense can be used to denote hypothetical present, and present generally often includes portions of the future. So that's why we have future time reference. So it depends on the context. I wish you weren't at work tomorrow. This weren't refers to the future. Kamo sreće da nisi sutra na poslu. And suppose, imagine it started raining during the match. Zamisli da počne da pada kiša tokom meča. So these are the two tenses in English. And we just finished them. So we are not going to the past subjunctive. Sorry, something happened with my presentations. So that's this part. I guess you knew most of these things, and not actually, I think you know, I'm pretty sure, I'm actually convinced you know all of this. It's just about presenting it in the right way. Now, the second verbal category, and probably the last one that we will manage to completely cover today, is the verbal category of mood. So the verbal category of mood is the verbal category that we defined 2 weeks ago, maybe a week ago. Time stands still for me. I'm not sure where we are right now. Every week looks the same. So verbal category, it was a long time ago, that's why I put it like this, which makes it possible for the speaker to express his or her attitude toward the factual content of the sentence. I know this by heart, that's why I could read it before it appeared. Mood fundamentally allows you to say whether something is a fact, a statement of a fact, whether it's a hypothesis or wishful thinking, or it's something that you are telling other people to do so that you're changing reality. In other words, a command. So statements, wishes or hypotheses, and commands. There are three types of mood in English, and they are called officially indicative, subjunctive, and imperative. If you try to Google, which I tried to do, and type in the search query for types of mood, this is not what you will get from Google. Obviously, not so many people are linguists. So what you will get is something like this, mood, happy, sad, angry, surprised, sick, love. Or my favorite, so Steven Seagal, mood chart. Look at the difference between happy and regretful, Steven Seagal, or terrified and amused. The man should have won at least 5 Oscars for his performance. And don't forget, he's a Serbian citizen. He's our brother. Uh, and I think he also has Russian citizenship. So Steven is really all over the place. But we will not talk about Steven or manga moods. We talk about grammatical moods, which I mentioned are indicative for statements of fact, subjunctive for hypotheses and wishes, and imperative for commands that change something in real life. So in typical indicative sentences, what you would normally use throughout your conversations, that's something like Bill Gates is extremely rich. That's a fact. Subjunctive, something like I wish I were as rich as Bill Gates. That's wishful thinking. You're not as rich as Bill Gates. I think that nobody in this group is as rich as Bill Gates. And then, of course, there is the imperative, which, as you know, is restricted in the sense that you cannot use stative verbs. You can only use dynamic verbs. So you cannot say no what our competitors plan to do. You have to use something dynamic like find out what our competitors plan to do. So indicative and subjunctive, they can be used with all verbs, stative and dynamic. But the imperative is a mood that, at least in English, is restricted to dynamic verbs. Most verbs are dynamic, but as you know, there are stative verbs such as know, own, seem, etc. But if we are honest with ourselves, this is all old stuff. We talked about this when I introduced you to all the verbal categories. So what is really new stuff, but even this was partially new because I went into more details, is that we should now look at each mood individually. So let's talk about indicative first. So nothing strange there. There's nothing interesting about indicative. That's the mood which we use most of the time. Some people call it evidential mood, and that's because the indicative mood is used for making factual statements and expressing positive beliefs. It is very difficult to give you a proper, let's say, definition of how to recognize the indicative mood. So in most grammar books, the definition of the indicative mood is a negative definition. So you will find something like the indicative mood is everything that you cannot characterize or categorize as subjunctive or imperative. So in other words, if it's not subjunctive and it's not imperative, it must be indicative. It's the most common mood in all languages, and that includes English. So John is eating a hot dog, John eats pies, that's indicative. And the indicative mood expresses assertion, like Little Rock is the capital of Arkansas. Denial, so it can be negative, but it's still a statement, so like ostriches cannot fly. And don't confuse mood with assertion and non-assertion. So even questions are still indicative. Have you finished your homework? This is a question that will provide a statement. So you're asking about something that you assume to be a fact. So don't confuse indicative with assertion and other grammatical categories. So indicative can be, assertive, non-assertive, negative, everything. And in the indicative mood, you can also express all other verbal categories. So the indicative mood is compatible with all the remaining 4 categories of tense, aspect, voice, and modality. But of course, the mood is indicative. On the other hand, the let's say the opposite of that in terms of compatibility with other verbal categories is the imperative mood. The imperative mood is not about positive beliefs and factual statements. It's actually about commands. So the imperative mood, but on the other hand, is actually the most powerful of them all. If I tell you, love is a wonderful feeling, do you do anything? No, you don't do anything. But if I ask you, if I tell you something like, please mute your microphones, if there's anybody who hasn't muted his or her mic, we'll try to mute it. So something will happen. With the imperative mood, you actually change things in real life. If you have authority, of course, you use the imperative to do something in real world. So it's unlike the subjunctive and the indicative. The imperative is actually results in something that is outside language. It results in an activity performed usually by somebody else. The imperative is also the simplest mood to explain. So there are not many forms of verbs in the imperative mood. So in the imperative mood, you simply take the base form, 0 suffix, and you treat this will be relevant for your second midterm, you treat these verb phrases as finite, although they usually don't express the subject, and they cannot express tense and modality and the perfect aspect, you still treat the imperative as finite. In Serbian, lični glagolski oblik. I mentioned this already. I told you it's the opposite of the indicative mood. So the indicative mood is compatible with tense, modality, all aspect forms, etc. Here, with the imperative, you cannot have tense, right? You're changing something in real life right now. You cannot make imperative in the past or in the future. You can report the imperative in indirect speech, but that's no longer the command. You're just telling somebody else what happened. You cannot make imperative modal. A command is a command. You cannot make it like possibility or deduction, and you cannot combine it with a perfective aspect which denotes relevance up to now. But you can combine it with the passive voice and progressive aspect. So you can say, for example, be preparing the dinner. This is the continuous meaning, or we call it in linguistics, actually the better term is progressive. Be preparing the dinner versus prepare the dinner. So here you emphasize that you want this person to be doing his or her job all the time, not, let's say, make pauses. This was taken from Friends. You know that Monica gets distracted easily if you watched Friends. And be prepared for the dinner, again from an episode of Friends, is the passive voice of the imperative mood. So instead of prepare the dinner, somebody else should be prepared for the dinner. So indicative mood, completely open to all verbal categories. Imperative mood, only passive voice and the progressive aspect. No tense, no modality. And that brings us to the most interesting of the moods. That's the subjunctive mood. As you can see here, the subjunctive in English is divided into present and past subjunctive. This also existed in Old English and Middle English. So this is a very old construction. This is like 2,000 years old. At least. So it's one of the oldest verbal forms in English. It's just that we don't use it so often these days because we have other means to express subjunctive meaning, but it still has the same function that it had in the age of Beowulf, and that's to express non-facts. So subjunctive expresses non-facts. Non-facts are things such as wishes, hypotheses, hopes, etc. And as I mentioned, it can express hopes, wishes, and suggestions as well. So everything that is not a fact, hope, wish, suggestion, recommendation, it can do that in present and the past. So we have present subjunctive and past subjunctive. Now, when it comes to present subjunctive, you should really try to use it a lot because, first of all, it's a marker of highly educated speakers. There are many studies which show, in English at least, you can have a Rolex watch and Boss suit on you if you're a man, or I don't know, Burberry, blazer and something like that if you're a woman, and Prada shoes. But the way that, at least in English, people judge the social standing of other people is usually through the way they talk. So the grammatical constructions, the vocabulary, and of course pronunciation are immediately used to put you in a certain category. And you know what they say, you never get a second chance to make the first impression. So how you use your language in the first minute or two of speaking to a stranger will determine the long-lasting impression on, that person will have on you. And if you can squeeze in some subjunctive in those 2 minutes, that will actually imply that you are highly educated and that you are also an intellectual and smart person. So how do you form the present subjunctive? It has 0 suffix. So believe it or not, what you're about to see are completely grammatical forms of the verbs to be and have, but in the subjunctive mood. I be, you be, he, she, it be, we be, they be. I have, you have, he, she, it have, we have, they have. Of course, the problem with subjunctive, the present subjunctive, is that you cannot really use it in the main clause. So that's actually the restriction of the present subjunctive. The present subjunctive is also more used in American English than in British English. In British English, you usually use should, but it is used actually for some really important things. So you have what is called the mandative subjunctive, when you give strong recommendations. Non-mandative subjunctive, which is about everything that is not really a strong recommendation or almost a command, so something that is not that. And you have formulaic subjunctive, which is about discourse formulas that you use in different situations in real life conversations. So mandative subjunctive is something like, what you hear in the courts of law, political discourse, scientific papers. This is why I told you that you sound very educated and smart if you use the present subjunctive. So the UN Council urges that President Mugabe reconsider his foreign policy. Notice that there is no s in the third person. That's because the present subjunctive is the base form in all numbers and all persons. So I be, you be, he be, we be, you be, they be. It is necessary that the plan remains secret. And it is his recommendation that John resign. As you can see, this is called mandative because you are not given a direct command, but you are urging for something to be done. So you're given a mandate for somebody to do something. So when you are not giving these strong recommendations, then you use the non-mandative subjunctive, and this is usually hypothetical expression, something like, if need be, ako baš treba, I'll do it. Even if that be the official view, I oppose it. And he must reject the proposal lest it cause strife and violence. This one is about British COVID restrictions. So you see, I found on purpose examples where you have the third person expressions, and you can see that you never use the S form here, because this is not the indicative mood, this is the subjunctive mood. And this is actually, for example, if you take proficiency exams in English, this is, for example, one of the differences between, let's say, advanced and proficiency, in terms that based on those common European framework of language references, if you are a proficient speaker, you can use hypothetical and similar expressions without errors. Even if you're an advanced speaker, this is considered to be beyond your reach, and you can hear people who have, you know, very good English make these mistakes all the time. And they would say, even if that is the official views, the official view, that's not the same. This, even if that be the official view, that means that this is, you know, in the domain of possibility. And formulaic subjunctive are actually more like sayings, discourse formulas, I call them. But you know these things. God save the queen. Heaven forbid that. Far be it from me. Suffice it to say. All these things are actually formulaic subjunctive. So many students, when I a long time ago gave a test to identify the mood of the verb save in the sentence God save the queen, many people said it was the imperative. How can you command God, right? God actually commands you. In a way, you should follow God's you know, guidelines. So this is not imperative, this is actually subjunctive. You're you know, hopeful that, and you're wishing that God would save the queen, and you're hoping, and this is in the domain of hypothesis, that heaven will not allow for something to happen, heaven forbid that, and so on. So these are all present subjunctive but formulaic expressions, including the anthem of the United Kingdom. So very briefly, I will go through each of these types. Here you have some examples. I suggested that she be working on the project. It is essential that the mission not fail. It is my decision that he be hired. So what can you notice about this present subjunctive? You cannot use it in the main clause, as I told you. The present subjunctive is only used in subordinate clauses. But can you notice something that is common for all these clauses?
They all use that.
Exactly. So that's the main rule. You have to use the present subjunctive in subordinate that clauses. Now, notice that in the first sentence I have suggested, in the second essential, and in the last decision. So all these words, suggested, essential, decision, they indicate that I'm making a strong recommendation, but they are not the same part of speech, right? What is suggested? Suggested is as a part of speech. You knew this. We practiced it. You were good at it. I remember. Verb.
Verb.
So suggested is a verb, but essential is not. What is essential?
Adjective.
Adjective, and decision, of course, is a
No.
No.
Exactly. So you shouldn't think of present subjunctive as something that you use after some verbs, like suggest. No, you can use it after verbs. We call them suasive verbs. And suasive is derived from suasion, which is persuasion as opposed to compulsion. That's actually this mandative meaning, that you are trying to persuade somebody to do something. You're giving a strong recommendation, but you are not forcing that person. That's why it's not the imperative. So these are called suasive verbs, suasive adjectives, and suasive nouns. So that actually, and we got there together, great job, is how you use the present mandative subjunctive. So this subjunctive that is so common in political discourse, that is so common in courts of law, that is so common in some, you know, business discussions, like what should be done, should somebody get fired, that's actually used with these suasive verbs, adjectives, and nouns. So those are verbs, adjectives, and nouns followed by that clauses that express persuasion, strong recommendations, etc. However, there are also some, let's say, other marginal possibilities, and here I actually label them. Condition: if that be necessary, we deny everything. Even if that be the case, we can still do it. He must do it, lest he get fired. And these are, of course, combinations that are used, like this, suffice it to say, perish the thought, that are used for non-mandative and formulaic subjunctive. So non-mandative subjunctive is again used in subordinate clauses, but not that clauses. You see, there's no that here. It's if, even if, lest, which means in order not to. So these are subordinate clauses of condition, concession, and purpose, and there are no suasive expressions in the main clause. And this is relatively productive. You can come up with a new, let's say, non-mandative subjunctive of this kind, but formulaic subjunctive is really like a set of idiomatic phrases. You cannot create new ones. So suffice it to say, that's the only way you can say it. Perish the thought, daleko bilo, for example, that's what it means. Come what may, God save the Queen. Be that as it may is actually one of the best known formulaic subjunctive expressions. Bilo kako bilo. So present subjunctive, as I mentioned, some final notes, is very common in American English, and you can hear it in Law and Order, NCIS, all this, series of that kind. But even in some, let's say, everyday communication, I watch Friends now with my daughter, so I'm very into Friends these days when I have time. But in American English, you can hear it, even in everyday communication when you're giving recommendations, especially. But in British English, for mandative subjunctive, you usually use should. I suggested that he leave would be I suggested that he should leave. When we talk about grammar, one of the most important things about the present subjunctive is that it is not subject to sequence of tenses. So what it means is that you do no shifts there. So in the present, you say, I demand that the chairman resign. If that same sentence is in the past, it's still resign. I demanded that the chairman resign. And you have to be really careful about that. This also is relevant for indirect speech and other grammatical transformations. So never apply sequence of tenses with the present subjunctive. Unlike the present subjunctive, which had three different subtypes, mandative, non-mandative, formulaic, and is actually alive and kicking in American English, constantly used even in TV series, past subjunctive is actually just what we call ver subjunctive. So everything that you may think is past subjunctive, something like I wish I knew the answer, that's not subjunctive. That's what we discussed when we talked about the past simple tense. past simple tense can denote hypothetical expressions. The past subjunctive is only the verb to be when it takes the form were and has subjunctive meaning. And that's a very important thing for you for the second midterm. I don't want to, jump ahead of the cart in the sense that I tell you now about all the details of the second midterm, especially since we haven't finished the verb phrase, and also you still haven't had your first midterm. But one of the tasks in the second midterm is to actually, you will get verb phrases and you will have to identify categories, verbal categories expressed through that verb phrase. So for example, for, let's say, must have been studying, you will say it has modality, it has perfective aspect because of have, it has the progressive aspect because of ing studying and been, and you will say that it's active. So when you see something like, I wish you were here, you will label it as past subjunctive. But if you say, I wish she knew the answer, that's not past subjunctive, that's past simple tense, indicative actually. We will practice this, but I'm just telling you that be careful, past subjunctive only applies to the verb to be. There's no other verb in the past that you will label as past subjunctive. So it has non-factual and hypothetical meaning like the mandative subjunctive, but and the present subjunctive, but it refers to the past. So here are some examples so we can get to its usage. If I were you, I wouldn't do it. He treats her as if he were her boss. If only she were here, and imagine I were as rich as Bill Gates. So if you used any other verb here, you would not label this as subjunctive. You would say that it's indicative, but you are using hypothetical past simple tense. And now I actually explained what these constructions are, right? I wanted to be more interactive, but they are all hypothetical. So this is all about hypothetical conditional, hypothetical comparison, wishes, and generally other hypothetical expressions. So if only she stayed here, like the penultimate example, would be again present, past simple, indicative, but having, secondary meaning of the past simple. Only were is labeled as past subjunctive. Now, strictly speaking, you may have heard these constructions being used with the verb that is not verb. So I wish you were, she were here, especially if you like listening to modern, let's say, music and people like John Legend and similar performers. You can hear things such as, I wish she was here. Now this actually is considered informal and you can hear it, and it's often used. It's okay to be used in informal situations, but as I mentioned, in the English-speaking communities, the way you speak is usually used to, get an impression of who you are in terms of your education, intelligence, smartness, politeness, everything. The moment you open your mouth, native speakers will have a certain impression about you based on the language that you use. And this is very informal, and it is very considered substandard even to this day. So you should not use it in formal situations. In formal situations, think of Pink Floyd and use I wish you were here, not I wish you was here. So One last note, which I mentioned, but I need to reiterate constantly, only if I had more free time. I wish I knew the secret of health and happiness. I wish you can warn me about the faulty brakes. These things express the subjunctive meaning in a way, but not really subjunctive. They express this hypothetical meaning that you can express through past subjunctive, but they are not past subjunctive. These are past tense forms with hypothetical meaning. Only were is labeled as past subjunctive. So these examples above are not past subjunctive. Only were. If only I were free on Saturday. The rest of it you will mark as hypothetical past tense. So we mentioned it earlier. That's the secondary meaning of the past tense. It refers to the present. It has hypothetical meaning, but it's not subjunctive. This at the bottom is the past subjunctive. And when it comes to usage, one additional note. So this is something that I assume you know, but it's worth mentioning just for all of us to be on the same page. How do you express, hypothetical meaning with past tense forms? So I wish I knew the secret of health and happiness. If only we had more time. I wish you had warned me about the faulty brakes before I took the car for a spin. So when you use the past simple tense, like I wish I knew the secret, if only we had more time, you are referring to the present. We discussed this when we talked about the past simple tense. So the past simple tense doesn't refer to the past. It actually, because of the hypothetical meaning, refers to the present. You would always translate it like volio bih da znam tajnu sreće i blagostanja kad bi samo imali više, kad bi imali, right? Odnosno da imamo, kada bismo imali više vremena. I wish you had warned me, kamo sreće da si me upozorio ili upozorila. So this, when you use the past perfect tense, like had warned, had knew, had known, had, this is actually what you use to refer to the past when you have hypothetical meaning. But of course, we forgot the future. Actually, we didn't forget the future. It's in the animation. When you want to express hypothetical meaning in the future, you use would. I wish you would buy a new oven. For example, you can tell that to your mom if she's constantly complaining about an oven, but cannot, get herself to buy a new one. So I wish you would buy a new oven. That's hypothetical meaning in the future. And actually, we have 19 minutes remaining. As I mentioned, I was pretty convinced that we would finish this, but there will be another verbal category that we will not be able to finish completely, and that's the verbal category of voice. And I will start those set of slides now, unless, of course, you have some comments on this, some feedback, because as I mentioned, subjunctive, I don't know how much you use it, but try to use it as much as possible, because and of course not for the sake of using it, but simply when there's a suitable context to use it, because it's one of the best markers of being highly educated, smart, having good English, etc. There are some studies, for example, Trump very rarely uses subjunctive.
Professor,
Obama, yes?
I do beg your pardon. What is the equivalent of subjunctive when it comes to Serbian language? If there is one, of course.
The subjunctive mood in Serbian, well, our languages are relatively different, English and Serbian.
Okay, just asking for the sake of fun.
But generally, we use different sets of hypothetical expressions. So, for example, like this, voleo bih da znam. tajnu sreće i blagostanja. Znači, in Serbian we use the fact that you're using those suasive words, suasive nouns, suasive adjectives, suasive verbs, nouns, adjectives, plus again that clause very often in Serbian that actually indicates the subjunctive mood. But some of these meanings are actually expressed through potencial. I'm not an expert on Serbian grammar, I have to admit that. I won't pretend that I know a lot about it. I only had one serious course in English syntax, but Serbian syntax, what did I say? English syntax, sorry. Thankfully, my wife is here to correct me. Yeah, I do know a little bit about the English syntax, but I don't know a lot about Serbian syntax. That's actually it. So suasive verbs plus subordinate clauses plus suasive adjectives and nouns and potential. Of course, there are two potentials in Serbian, and that corresponds to the present and past subjunctive for some of these hypothetical meanings. But for example, for mandative subjunctive, we have these expressions such as trebao bi da se otpusti, which we try to make impersonal. But that's a good, actually, that's a good topic, for example, for a master's thesis in translation. It would be interesting to see how these English mandative, non-mandative, and past subjunctive expressions are translated into Serbian.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor, for your explanation.
Olga actually has an article on that parts of this analysis, so we can actually put it on the website. Okay, great. Thanks for the question. Yeah. Sometimes we don't have corresponding, one corresponding grammatical form. Now, the voice. Of course, we're not talking about the TV show with the same name, nor are we talking about what I'm now using to communicate to you. What we are talking about is the voice as a verbal category. So, again, a week ago, we said it was a verbal category, which makes it possible for the speaker to express one and the same activity in two ways. So you don't change the facts, you just change what is more important. And this is where I introduce you to the famous sentence, the queen opened the bridge, versus the bridge was opened by the queen. And of course, voice is restricted to transitive verbs only, but its purpose is to actually allow you to have different things at the end of the sentence. In English, not in all languages, but in English, unless you use emphatic stress, so unless you stress a particular word in your sentence to change the focus, so if you're using natural intonation and natural stress, the most important piece of information will always be at the end. That's the new information. So old information is at the beginning. This goes back to our very first class on subject and the predicate. Subject is old information, predicate is what you say about the subject, new information, but the end of the predicate and the end of the sentence is the key piece of information. You know that you work that way because we always remember the last thing that was mentioned, right? Because somehow we are hardwired to focus on that last part because that's like the newest piece of information. So if you say John bought a Mercedes M500, the important thing here is that he didn't buy, I don't know, I'm not good at Mercedes models, but this is, M500, it's a prototype, but it was possible to buy it. So he didn't buy something that, I don't know, people used in the 1980s. So the most important piece of information is the exact model of the Mercedes car. So it's a cool car. Look at it. Yeah, it's like a Tesla. But okay. It's actually like an airplane. But this is old stuff. I mean, not the Mercedes, the voice. So what is new is, of course, that what you know is that in English it's a binary opposition. So you only have two possibilities, 0 and 1, so to say, like computers, 0 and 1. But in this case, it's not 0 and 1, it's active and passive. I don't want to offend your knowledge of English, so I will very quickly skip through this part, but you know that this is actually a transformation that involves changes at two levels. The changes at the level of the clause and the verb phrase. So you do something to the clause, the subject becomes the by phrase, the object becomes the subject, and the verb phrase gets the past participle preceded by the verb to be. And of course, all the time, which we also used as a test, you have to be aware that only transitive verbs can be passivized. So if something cannot be passivized, it's very likely that it's not an object and the verb is not transitive. This is one of the best tests to determine if something is a subject complement or an object. So if John is a doctor, you cannot say a doctor is been by John. But if you say John bought a book was bought by John, then it's obvious that what follows the verb is an object because it can be passivized. So as I said, active subject becomes the passive agent, active object becomes the passive subject, by is introduced in front of the agent, and out of John kissed Mary, you get Mary was kissed by John. So this is here just for the sake of transparency, in the sense that I think it's important to mention it, but of course you all know this. It's just, something that you should also mention in the oral exam, but the assumption is that this is tackled a long time ago in the 6th or the 7th grade. So this is, these are the examples of transformations in different verbal categories. So present, kisses becomes is kissed, past kissed was kissed, modal becomes maybe kissed, perfective has kissed because has been kissed, progressive is being kissed, and modal plus perfective may have been kissed. In other words, the passive voice is compatible with all those categories that we mentioned. So you can have the passive voice in every tense, in every aspect. You can combine it with modality. And as you saw in the discussion that we had on the imperative mood, you can also say be prepared for this dinner. So you can even combine it with the imperative mood. So the voice can be combined with all types of verbal categories. So there are no restrictions, like the imperative mood, for example, has some restrictions. Except for, of course, the type of the verb. It has to be a transitive verb. And you know that this, you always have to use the passive auxiliary be. And in substandard varieties, and sometimes in the standard varieties, when you want to express the effect, you, instead of the passive be, you can use the passive get. This is what we call get passive, but the get passive is rare because it is restricted to constructions without an animate agent. So the boy got hurt on his way from work. You cannot say something that has an animate agent. So the boy got given a violin by his father. So you cannot express the animate agent. The boy got hurt on his way from work. We don't know who the agent is, who hurt the boy. But if you mention the agent, like the boy got given a violin by his father, then it doesn't work. So that's actually the main distinction. So get passive is not compatible really with by phrases. And as I mentioned, it should be avoided in formal style. It's informal, and it's less frequent, of course, than be passive. So our house is getting painted. If they make such criticisms, that they will get treated with the contempt they deserve. The story eventually got translated into English. As you can see, it's usually used in constructions that denote that there is a result that will happen. So let me check the time. We have 7 minutes, so most likely we will not be able to finish the whole section on voice, but what actually remains to be done here over the next 7 minutes and maybe next Thursday, parts of these slides, is voice constraints. So I mentioned that the passive is restricted by the fact that you must use the transitive verbs. But there are also a couple of other constraints on whether you can use the passive voice or no, or you cannot use it. So there are 4 such constraints. There are voice constraints associated with the verb, including the transitivity, voice constraints associated with the object, voice constraints associated with the meaning, because by passivizing, for example, you can change the meaning and you can get a completely different meaning. You'll see some examples. And sometimes you simply, if you're a native speaker and you ask him like, why didn't you use the passive, they will tell you like, nobody would use the passive voice in this situation. So some restrictions are simply there because no native speaker would use them. We call it frequency of use, but that actually means that this is not a normal way to express something in those circumstances. So the passive voice is not what native speakers would use. So it's like a usage restriction. So when it comes to verbs, as you know, there are greater restrictions on verbs occurring in the passive than in the active. Of course, you know that intensive and intransitive verbs can never take the passive voice, but some transitive verbs can also not be passivized. So there is a small number of transitive verbs that simply do not tolerate the passive voice. And let me show you some examples. They have a nice house. What would be the passive counterpart? It would be terrible, right? A nice house is had by them. He lacks confidence. Confidence is lacked by him. Terrible. The room holds 50 people. 50 people are held by the room, unless the room is, artificial intelligence that decided to rebel against humans, then it's not grammatical. If the room is, a thinking, device, then this is possible, but only in sci-fi movies. The dress becomes her. This is my favorite. She's become by the dress. Unless you're creating a very low, low budget horror movie, she is become by the dress is not possible. The coat does not fit you. You are not fitted by the coat. That's again terrible. So what can you conclude? What kind of verbs are, let's say, have, lack, become? They are stative verbs, and verbs such as lack and hold are, let's say, existential transitive verbs. So this is actually the reason. So all these verbs are transitive. This is the interesting thing. They're all transitive, but they cannot be passivized because they are either stative or they denote existential conditions or states, like lack. Or fit, does not fit you, or the dress becomes her. So you cannot passivize them. So stative verbs generally, but also those that denote these existential relationships. And surprisingly, there's the other side of the story. Some transitive verbs only occur in the passive voice. So there are those transitive verbs which cannot be passivized, but there are some transitive verbs which never occur in the active voice. And of course, that may not that may not hold true for all the meanings of those verbs, but for particular meanings there are certain verbs that only appear in the passive voice, and the best known example is the verb say. When you have an expression such as John was said to be a good teacher, this is not like John says hi. This is when you report when you actually are saying that this is like a common opinion about somebody. This only can occur in the passive voice. You cannot make it active and say something like they said him to be a good teacher. And this holds true for most of these passive expressions that have to do with the opinions of other people, reputation, and general, social relations that you express. Gossips. So John was reputed to be a good teacher. You cannot say they reputed him to be a good teacher. And that is actually not the whole story, because there are also prepositional verbs. So prepositional verbs are those verbs which are followed by prepositional phrases. And after this slide we stop, I promise. I know that it's noon. So let me just show you. This is the last slide on verb constraints. So the engineers went carefully into the tunnel. You cannot say the tunnel was very carefully gone into by the engineers. But when you say the tunnel, the engineers went very carefully into the problem, and you passivize it, it's okay. The problem was very carefully gone into by the engineers. And I have a similar example. They arrived at the splendid stadium. Terrible, terrible if you say the splendid stadium was arrived at. But if you change the stadium with result, they arrived at the expected result, it's perfect in the passive voice. The expected result was arrived at. So why is this happening? What is the system here? The system is that in prepositional verb constructions, if you have the abstract subject, passive subject, that's okay. So the problem is abstract, the result is abstract. But when you have concrete passive subjects, so real things, the tunnel, the splendid stadium, it doesn't work. So this is actually the restriction. And sometimes there are, there are prepositional verbs which do not always follow this pattern. There are always exceptions, but most of prepositional verbs behave like gone into and arrived at. So there are a couple of exceptions, but that's it. So we didn't cover voice constraints of the object, voice constraints due to frequency of use, and the voice constraints due to the changes in meaning. The good news is this is under 10 slides, so that's like 15 minutes. So we will do that next week, and then we will finish the aspect and modality, and we will be on the verge of finishing the verb phrase, because today we did tense, we did mood, we are about to finish voice. So aspect and modality are two big topics that remain, but actually aspect is the biggest of them. So what can I say except thank you for the privilege of your time. Thank you for the comments and the feedback. This is the end of the lecture, and I will stop recording now. And once the recording